about the Eucharist. Because the Eucharist in the sense of being a sacrifice on behalf of all and for all. Because we're moving away from an image of a sacrifice of appeasement on the cross. And there's the images of Holy Friday are sort of inextricably linked with the Eucharistic liturgy. And you could have a little bit more insight on what it would mean for the Eucharist to be a sacrifice on behalf of all and for all.
The Eucharistic symbol, which is also real, admits or is susceptible to a wonderful and beautiful long list of meanings. It is the bread that gathers the people together after the dispersion, after the flood, in the ancient liturgy. But where it comes to play in the sacrificial language is that Jesus, remember he said, except a grain of wheat fall and die, it cannot give life. It cannot grow to bear fruit. So in a very simple way, almost startling simple way, you could say that Jesus died on the cross and descended into hell so that he would give us the harvest, the fruit of the Eucharist. Because the Eucharist is indeed the fruit of his self-sacrifice. Is that sufficient?
In the sense, because I've thought of the Eucharist in a way of, insofar as it's part of joining to the body of the resurrected Christ, right? That we participate in the resurrection. But there's of course the sort of liturgical gesture of what seems to me to be mirroring sort of temple sacrifice of having a sacrifice offered to God on the altar.
There's certainly continuity, but the Eucharist is also a reflection of the one total and ultimate sacrifice that all the temple sacrifices anticipated, whereas the Eucharist is an anamnesis, or a calling to mind in reality of the one sacrifice. So it's all centered on the cross. But yeah, the Eucharist is I don't want to say looking backwards, because that's not the meaning of anamnesis. It's like actually being there in contemporaneity. But yes, there's certainly cultic language in the Divine Liturgy surrounding the Eucharist, and it's because of that. But it's still all predicated on the theme of kenosis rather than violent appeasement.
And there's very specifically, there's this clarification with unbloody sacrifice.
Unbloody sacrifice.
So that insistence.
Yes.
When you hear it, when all that you're said, it's a very interesting. I mean, it really defines it. Yeah. And then logical or rational sacrifice, or literally logical.
Yeah, as distinct from the narratives of the world. This is logical, whereas under the irrational powers, that sacrifice is irrational.
So those are unbloody and logical, or rational sacrifice. It sets it clearly.
Yeah.
You talked about Abel's sacrifice of giving himself and the whole kenosis, and that's really what God wants, is for us to give ourselves to him. Can you talk maybe a little bit about, I mean, on the one hand it would seem like the most natural thing to do, but why it is so difficult for so many people, and a lot of us tend to hold on, and we live in this sin of this cloud of hell, like you said sometimes, and we want to trust God, and yet it's hard to give of yourself for some reason, and everyone has their own story. But can you talk about that, and maybe what steps can we move closer to that, of giving ourselves and purely and in a way that's real, but even maybe taking small steps if you can't just
No, I appreciate the wideness of your question. However, there is a surprisingly simple thread that goes through your tapestry, and it starts out with "work out your salvation with fear and trembling," from St. Paul in Philippians. But really, our whole ascetical tradition of fasting and prayers, especially entering into liturgy is fundamentally deifying. In fact, we mentioned that in some of our ambon prayers at the end, that we thank God for this deifying liturgy, so that by it we enter into theosis. But there's always an exchange. It takes kenosis to enter into divine liturgy, right? Because you have better things to do on Sunday morning. Well, not now. You're being a convert. We realize that that's entirely ridiculous. But the temptation is that you must deny yourself in order to just go to liturgy. And then every single one of our acts of ascesis is really a step of kenosis. That's really the meaning of each of our ascetical endeavors. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, if you sat on a pillar, isn't that really a beautiful manifestation of kenosis? But
yeah, like I mean, maybe I'm being a bit too revealing here. It's a struggle for me sometimes. Like sometimes I will go to a service or a Lenten service, and my heart's not really there. I'm like, I don't, and I'm like, and then I feel like, well, I probably shouldn't have come if my heart's not really here. You know what I mean? Like it's
no, you should come. You should come because your heart's not there. Okay. Good. Let me suggest. Can I ask you to do a favor for me? And I ask everyone to do this. Mm-hmm. I have a hypothesis, a theory, and we can experiment with this. We can be empirical. Hierotheus Vlahos says, since Orthodoxy is really a science, although it's not a laboratory science, but it's an empirical science based on the real experience of the fathers and the saints. Okay, so here's an experiment. I have this idea that I can't preach yet, and I need it to be confirmed. So right now it's just thea logomena. Have you thrown that word on them yet?
No.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Thea logomena means private opinion. It might be right, but then again, it might not. Okay, so test out this theory for me. And I'm not just kidding. I'd really like your feedback. My email address is somewhere. So you tell me if this is true. I'd like to know if it's true, and I think it is, that the harder a self-sacrifice, the more efficacious it will be. Like the harder it is to forgive someone, and when we pray for that horrible enemy, the more powerful the result will be. So when you bring yourself who doesn't want to go to liturgy or to a Lenten service, that's precisely the moment to go. So if you can experiment with that hypothesis, and you probably have to do a few observations and then make your inference from the data and let me know. But does that make sense? That the very difficulty of it might be even a more efficacious exchange.
I'm wondering if you can sort of, like, since we've talked about, in a sense, reading the same passages but in a completely different way, I was wondering if you could kind of reread the passage where it says that, he was wounded for our transgressions, mm-hmm. and etc., and has taken upon the iniquity of us all. Mm-hmm. If you could kind of reread that passage through an Orthodox perspective.
And that's Isaiah 53. Yeah. And we intimately involve ourselves in that passage at every proscomedia, which is the preparation of the lamb, mm-hmm. Which is what we call the cube of bread and the wine for the liturgy. He was wounded for our transgressions. Again, it's really a simple change of perspective or point of view. Who is doing the wounding? I don't doubt at all that he was wounded, and I don't doubt at all that our transgressions were the reason why he came to be wounded, but who's doing the wounding? That's exactly what St. Gregory of the theologian asked. Okay. Was it not, in my old Protestant way of thinking, the one doing the wounding was God the Father? Okay. But in patristic, in Orthodox, in that narrative, the wounding was the sin itself. Sin carries its own violence.
What about, but the use of the word for, I mean, is that just a bad translation?
Is wounded for...
Yeah.
Well, I think it admits that translation too. For, that preposition is...
Because really you'd think that it would be, he was wounded by our transgressions, if you know what I mean. Do you understand what I'm
Yeah,
asking?
I think the word for, if you look in the Greek, I think you'll find that that's certainly the way the fathers understood that they never, you cannot find an Eastern father who's going to say that the God the Father was the one who punished his son.
So basically you would say that that's kind of a bad translation then, to think of it that way.
In a word, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
makes sense, for sure.
Yeah, I'll go with the grammatical ambiguity, sure.
Yeah.
But still, my question was always, why do people opt for God the Father being the imposer of violence? I would think that since we were there first in telling the story, then shouldn't the burden of proof be on them? Shouldn't our Reformation and Protestant friends, shouldn't they explain to us why they went from the first primordial narrative of peace, why they opted for this one instead? That was so suspiciously similar to the old style sacrificial doctrine of the pagan world. But you're right about the grammatical ambiguity. I'll take that. For. Is that sufficient?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine. Yeah. Thank you.
I just want to say, I really like the way that Hebrews 10 sort of fits in exactly what you're saying. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Consequently, Christ came into the world. He said, sacrifices and offerings you had not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. Burnt offerings and sin offerings I have taken no pleasure. And it fits very well. That's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. God does not listen to violent narratives. Because they're not directed to him. They're not his nature.
It's sort of weird. It's part of his law, but it's not what he's really looking for. You're right. It's
well, I would say it's
there, but
I would say it's encapsulated, and it is climactically summarized by the cross. The entire law in the Old Testament was fulfilled and symbolized in the achievement of the cross. But it was in an odd way. How do we depict Jesus on the cross? Do we depict him? I know that there are images in our churches to the contrary, but how should the cross, Jesus on the cross, be depicted in the Orthodox Church? As someone who's I know that we talk about his suffering, we show the suffering Jesus on the cross, especially in the humility of Christ icon. But how do we show him on the cross? What words do we like to put on that icon? Not only the King of the Jews, but the King of Glory. This is again, that symbol that the glory of God is most greatly revealed at the cross. Not at the Ark of the Covenant, not at the temple. In Russian, we say Tsar Slava, which I think is a beautiful name. It just means Tsar, King. Slava means glory, King of glory.
Tsar Slava.
Tsar Slava.
Slava.
Yeah. Then the Slavs called themselves by that name. Yeah. The Romans, when they said Slav, you know what they meant? They meant slave. They meant slave. That's what Slavs were good for. And oddly, Slava, we turned into our language to mean glory.
And Serbs have Slava as a celebration.
Yeah. And in Latin, it kind of means slave. That's a nice linguistic turnaround that we did. Typical Christian stuff. It turns things upside down. Yes.
Last year I walked into an Orthodox church right around now, and I did the whole, I didn't know anything about Orthodoxy, but I did the whole Holy Week with the church. And on the day, I guess it was on the Friday, we did we had Jesus the body of Jesus in a coffin at the front, or on the Saturday, I guess. There was like a coffin.
In the tomb, right?
Yeah, the tomb at the front. And now, at that moment, like sometime during that liturgy service, I realized that God came to earth and became fully man and fully God, on earth, and we found a reason to kill him. And at that moment, I shuddered, I felt sick, I felt angry, depressed, and all of these things. And I really believe that that's the moment when I became Orthodox. But I also felt kind of a hatred or an anger towards the characters or the groups of people involved in the crucifixion and the reason for it happening.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if what you're presenting today about changing our perspective on the need for the cross or on its actual purpose in the story, should I be looking at those people involved a little different or a little better?
I think you should see them as tragic characters, as people who are caught up into the violent narrative of the world. When I say that the cross is an act of God's peace and nonviolence, that's God's action. But the world's reaction against all acts of kenosis and every appearance of theosis, how does the world react? With violence. And so the cross was the world's greatest act of violence, whereas the same cross was God's greatest act of peace. So, now that you are the receiver of the benefit of the cross, now that you have to do to Christ's enemies the same thing that he did, which was, what did he say on the cross?
Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Help me here. Father, forgive them, for they have no idea what they're doing. Did they really know that they were killing the Son of God? And by the way, you know who else is ignorant of what he was doing? Had he been a good theologian and not a latent Arian, the devil would never have permitted this to happen. Because the fathers, especially the early fathers, are all agreed by saying that there was a trick involved, that when Jesus descended in his human soul into hell, that Satan had no idea that there was an unbreakable union between the humanity of Christ and his divinity. And when that divinity was revealed at the very extremity of human wandering from the fall, hell itself, Jesus revealed his glory at that point. And Satan was completely overthrown. So had he known that, had he gone to my seminary class, or your catechism. He would never have done this. So you pray for the enemies of Christ, since they are now your enemies. The early fathers, by the way, called that idea of Jesus, of Satan not knowing that Jesus is the Son of God, they call that the divine fish hook. That the humanity of Jesus was the worm on the bait, and Satan took the bait, hook, line, and sinker. And it's like he brought in a bomb into hell, and Jesus exploded it with his divinity. The greatest jailbreak of all time.
If you were to, sometimes non-Christians might ask you, or if they were to ask us, okay, how do you see the cross? And you don't have a long time to explain it, and it is profound, but, the Protestant version is, Christ died for our sins, and is there a succinct way of explaining the cross from an Orthodox point of view?
You want a sound bite?
Something to help us or even others understand.
I'm sorry, that's an inside joke between Father and me. We were complaining about that very thing, that those Protestants, and I was one, we had sound bites for everything.
Yeah.
It's like, we could sum up our Protestant catechesis over 20, 30, 50 years. We could sum it up in just a few words, and we Orthodox have nothing like that, don't we? We have ourselves, right? Are you not an icon of Christ? So if they ask you, you can try your best and give your best idea of doctrine, but don't fall prey to the demand for a short, easy answer. Because while Orthodoxy is beautiful, it is not easy. And while we are a religion of peace, we're still very hard. And we will not give up that hardness, right? So you tell them, if you really want to know and want to do something more than pigeonhole me into a category, you come with me. In fact, I'll pray here right now if you want to listen to my prayers, because that's where my belief resides. Not in a bunch of propositions, but my belief is rooted in my prayers. Then he'll understand. Little by little.
There is like a Mark Twain story that brought to mind. I don't know what you think. Have you ever heard the story? I forget how it goes, but where he satirizes this action and reaction, where the boy, he goes to the lake to swim on Sunday, and does he drown? No, of course he doesn't drown. He had a great time, and he satirizes the expectation that every action has a negative reaction, right?
Yeah.
Like he was playing with a loaded gun. Did he shoot his family? No, of course not. Who would keep a loaded gun in the house, right? And so it's always these jokes, right? That the little moral, it ties up in a little moral, that you do something and, the karma kind of aspect of it. Seems like, Mark Twain was a kind of unbeliever. Like it seems like that there's an atheism that rejects correctly, like maybe this whipping boy image. Like I think, it correctly diagnoses a problem without maybe having the correct solution, but
You're absolutely right. I'm glad you brought that up. Mark Twain, you can't call Mark Twain a Christian writer by a long shot. If you do, then we need to talk. But at the same time, Mark Twain correctly critiques in a prophetic way the Western degenerate Christian narrative, which is like a derivative of, they remember a few things about the apostolic teaching, but as they go further and further away, those things are isolated and become in their isolation distorting and heretical. And so Mark Twain says, hey, I heard that you love this Christ man, but why are you believing in a God of karma? Well, he didn't use that word, but why are you believing in this God of, I will give you back what you do. There's always a payback. And in another story, Mark Twain suggests that if you believe in that long enough, that God is a God of wrath, then eventually your human nature is going to drive you to atheism, if not outright nihilism. And he says that in his really scary story that I read at too young of an age. I think I was 14 when I read The Mysterious Stranger. Don't read that late at night, especially out here. Because it's a really spooky story, and it really ends up on a grievously nihilistic note. Mark Twain reminds me of the postmodern critique that's going on right now with Deleuze, Deman. Any view into postmodern studies at all, like at Toronto? So you know that the whole idea in the postmodern critique is to take apart in literature and other artistic acts, to take apart the edifice of modernity that was constructed by Hegel and some of his friends. And they're saying that too is not a good, that totality is not a good structure, because look at the cost. And so in that critique, I certainly agree with them, but in what they say about finality, I don't. So I have the same attitude toward them and Mark Twain as you do.
Just to, I was a Protestant for 15 years, evangelical, and even though their theology is very judicial and legal, Christ paid us a debt that we couldn't pay and it was God's wrath. In practice, I still, just to balance it out, because not everyone here is Protestant, but in practice, in my experience, the narrative was still a lot about God's grace, and God is a God of love. God loves us, and that's what I find a lot of Protestants in my circles were still living, even though the theology might have been a bit off and points to a wrathful God. In practice, a lot of them still experience the grace and love of God, and that's what they felt. And I just don't want everyone who's cradle Orthodox thinking every Protestant thinks God is wrathful, and if I don't obey him, you know what I mean?
No, and you're right. The behavior of many, my evangelical family, I love them, and they love me, and they're beautiful people, and they act a lot better than I do many times. And in many Protestant churches, there's a sense of body life and a sense of community that would be good for many Orthodox churches to take notes from. It's true. And they have a latent, primitive understanding of what they call discipleship, that I think we would serve them, they would be served so well to understand, to put their experience into a theology that actually informs their experience. Right now, there's a divorce between theology and their experience so much that they have ended up in the past 20 years discarding theology. There's an anti-theology and anti-intellectuality in evangelicalism, and one of the reasons for that is because they've looked at their theology and they said, this is not true to what we experience of God. But they won't ever see. If you see that in print somewhere, you come and tell me, and I'll throw a party. Well, that's true. But at the same time, I should also say I have Buddhist and atheistic friends who have a morality that's beautiful, and they know how to love.
Absolutely.
So, same thing.
Just quickly, you know have you ever read the C.S. Lewis Language in the Wardrobe?
Yeah.
What? It's funny because at first I was thinking, well, he's presented it wrong, and then you mentioned the trick part, and that's a big part of it as well. So does he present it well, or does he present it wrong?
Well,
you read that to kids, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, don't put too much into... because really, if you take The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a doctrinal exposition, it's pretty bad, especially at the atonement. That is not at all the Eastern understanding of the atonement. It's very very Anselmic. So what I said about Anselm's Cur Deus Homo, that's basically the predicate for C.S. Lewis in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Then at other times he says things in the rest of the books that are very Eastern. So go figure. He's hard to take. I love his writing. I think he's one of the best Christian writers of the English language possible. For a more orthodox reading, you should probably read J.R. Tolkien and Charles Williams. J.R. Tolkien, when he was writing The Lord of the Rings, went to his little Roman Catholic chapel every day and prayed to the Virgin for her intercessions to help him write this book. The Lord of the Rings is essentially a Marian book. Don't get me started about Lord of the Rings. Just warning.
We should have a special session.
My second idea for a retreat was to do a retreat on J.R. Tolkien's. What's the name of that story? It's not The Hobbit, not Lord of the Rings, but one of his minor stories.
Silmarillion? Silmarillion?
The Silmarillion?
No, not the Silmarillion. It's not Smith of Wooten Major. It's something else.
Gawain and the Green Knight?
No, it's not that either. I'll get back to you. It's a beautiful story. I know the story, but I don't know the title. It's that getting over 50 thing, you know.
Senior moment.
Yeah, senior moment. But yeah, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I had my kids. I read it aloud to them, but I did not try to tie the lion's self-sacrifice on the stone table directly to the cross, even though it was a self-sacrifice. That's true, but it was done for the satisfaction of the unwritten law, of the law on the table, and that's what bothered me.
Okay, so we're going to try to make lunch.
Oh, I know the title now. But now that I remembered, I better get it out because I'll forget it. Leaf by Niggle. Niggle. Leaf by Niggle. Okay, so if I ever do a retreat again, I'll
remind you. So we're going to try to have lunch. Whoever is Paul, who's setting up?
Oh my God. That'll be Omega team, my team.
So, the Omega, can we set up a table with the bread, and can they make a big, huge Omega salad? Use as much as you can.